have been the main consequences of COP21 for climate change and energy policies? Well, overall, the idea is that climate change and the Paris Agreement, climate change negotiations and the Paris Agreement, have anchored expectations as regards a low-carbon future.
The agreement in Paris at the end of last year has been a major milestone. For the first time, all countries of the world agreed that they want jointly do something against climate change and agreed that each of them takes certain limits on their emissions. That has never happened before.
I think Paris will certainly have an impact on climate and energy policies across the European Union. But we need to be careful. Paris is another landmark, but it's a landmark that the European Union and the countries in the European Union have been very active in moving towards. The EU has pushed ambitious climate action. We recently have seen a much greater push for climate action from China, in particular for commercial reasons. The Chinese and the US agreed on an emissions reduction accord before Paris. So really we had 3/4 of the world's output and emissions already pushing for ambitious climate action before Paris. So if you like, Paris was as much a cause as a consequence of this profound change. And now we're in the environment where all the countries that ratified the Paris Accord, that is every country in the world effectively, will now have to consider ways to implement their own plans for emissions reductions, but in a way that is in their own self-interest, in a way that maximizes their opportunities and not as part of some sort of global burden sharing arrangement, because that isn't going to push ambitious action. Opportunity, I think, is.
And it showed that, that the way the European Union pushed in the past for such a global agreement was the right one. Now, we also see with the Paris Agreement that the role of the European Union in international climate negotiation is getting smaller. Europe only represents 10% of global emissions. So the agreement between the US and China seems to have been much more important for getting the Paris Agreement. And now their joint agreement on ratification also shows that those two countries are much stronger now in pushing the agenda.
We have gone from sharing the burden to competing for market opportunities. The European Union, for example, states that the global market for green technologies is going to double or even triple up to 2020, and that is where we need to be in that competition for market opportunities. Interest rates are so low at the moment that it's a good time to invest, and the co-benefits of action on climate change imply that, well, it's a very strong argument to act. We are reducing air pollution, we're improving traffic jams, etc., and that has a translation in terms of GDP losses. The European Union has seen its climate leadership efforts backed by the Paris Agreement. French diplomacy has been praised worldwide, and although we are reducing our weight in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and obviously also our economic clout, that doesn't mean that the European Union has nothing to offer in terms of international climate negotiations.
So Europe should try to find a new role in international climate policy, and I think there are 3 main pillars for the European Union to play into that. I would call them the 3 E's. The first is investment. Investment means that Europe agreed to put climate finance on the table in the order of some 30 billion euros per year, which should help to invest in low carbon technologies outside Europe, which would present a tremendous business opportunity for European companies. The second one is innovation. Here, Europe already paved the way by heavily subsidizing renewables in the past. It led to lower cost of renewables, which in the end helped a lot to enable the deal in Paris. So the European Union should continue its move towards bringing down the cost of new technologies, towards bringing down the cost of system integration of renewables, because this again will imply significant business opportunities for European companies, but also will help other countries to actually engage in decarbonization, Just think of Indian coal-fired power plants being replaced by renewables. And the third one, the third E, is institutions. Here the European Union has a great track record in setting up climate institutions. The European emission trading system is the largest emission trading system in the world. It's really the pilot for everybody else. Everybody that is thinking about emission trading is looking into that. And this experience should be strengthened and spread throughout the world. So I think Europe, despite having comparatively small emissions and therefore not such a big say in the big questions on mitigation, might have an extremely productive role for decarbonization, not only in the EU but beyond.
We also have challenges, of course. We have the challenge of increasing interconnection, further deployment of renewable energies. We have still work to do in terms of energy efficiency. We have to finance energy efficiency improvements. We have to lure our companies to be part of the demand response. And those are basically the main challenges that we see at the European Union level.
And we need to have a competitive industry sector in Europe because it's been proven that is the most efficient industry. The European are the most efficient industrial players in the world. We should implement policies that would enhance and make European industry a competitive one.
Some of the consequences to the European Union and also to the United States from the COP21 and the agreement in Paris represents a commitment by various developed countries and developing countries in a common goal.
So in the US, the whole issue of climate change is a much more politically fraught and politically partisan issue. It has always been that way, and it looks like it's going to remain that way in what is, I would argue, a particularly dirty campaign insofar as the usual mudslinging that you get in American presidential campaigns this time round has reached a new height, arguably with a lot more misinformation put into play. There has been a high degree of political misinformation on climate change in the past. There's no evidence that that's going to stop. The problem is we just don't know what the landscape's going to look like after November, in particular if we see a Trump victory. If we see a Clinton victory, I think we'll be back to pretty much where we were under Obama, which is a lot of difficulty getting action through both houses of Congress. It's unlikely that the Democrats will carry both houses, and so again, we're going to have a degree of problems in pushing any environmental legislation that isn't at the executive level through Congress. If we don't have a Clinton presidency and we have a Trump presidency, then really there's all to play for. I have, I'm not an America expert, but even those that are will tell you that it's really all to play for. This is uncharted territory, and we will just have to wait and see.
With respect to the impact from the U.S. elections on climate change and the power sector, which is one of the most polluting or the most polluting sector in the economy, the two candidates that we have are very, very different in their points of view from climate change. One denies that climate change exists. The other one very much looks forward to continuing what the current administration has been working on. So depending on who wins the White House, we can expect to have certain policies changed. The most dramatical impact would be on who would be the appointee to be the next Supreme Court justice. That could have an effect on some of the federal policies for climate change and the respective laws for the energy. But states in the US have already been working for many years, have their own individual goals for climate, energy efficiency, and renewable energy, and those will continue to work.
And it's been perhaps a common understanding that in the case where Trump would be elected, we would be seeing perhaps a less cooperative role by the US with the rest of the world in terms of the fight against global warming, climate change. Whereas if Clinton were the one elected, perhaps it'll be the US policy will be more aligned with those who are taking a more aggressive and a more ambitious approach regarding the climate change.
Is the time to put all these intentions into real-world actions. But I think that we will also agree that what has been done up to now is not enough. That we have to not only to continue, but to reinforce the actions that we have done to decarbonize the economy. We also think that in order to be efficient in these decarbonizing activities, we should put a price to the CO2. We think that all agents that emit CO2 to the atmosphere should pay its cost. In Europe, we have been, and we are in the forefront of this decarbonization process. And as a proof of that, there's the commitments of reducing CO2 emissions, to develop more renewables, and the energy efficient commitments. And this has been translated into specific targets to 2020 and 2030. The lion's share of the CO2 reduction has been borne and is being borne by the electricity sector. In particular, I think it's relevant to look at the transport sector, which has been the only sector that between 1990 and now has increased its emissions, while the other sectors have reduced them. On the other hand, we think that while there's not a level playing field at the global level on CO2 reduction commitments, the European industry should be protected. The industry that is at carbon leakage risk should have special treatment and be protected to maintain its competitiveness.